Hi everybody, welcome to week 7. So that means we are officially halfway through, a little more than halfway through for the summer term. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what's next, or actually what's coming up for the rest of the term. I'm going to spend a slide doing that. And then I want to spend the rest of this lecture talking about the material that I've had you read for this week, and which is actually the 4th of July weekend coming up. So I have a special announcement about that as well. So let's get right into that. Okay, so upcoming events. The first big thing is I am taking a hiatus from the discussion for this week. Not completely letting you off the hook in terms of work. You do have a reading reflection that is due on Saturday, July 2nd. So I want you to be able to spend your time this week working on that reading reflection. But I'm going to not have a discussion this week so that once you get done with that reflection and send it in to me, you can enjoy the 4th of July weekend, which I want everybody to do. So let me talk about the reading reflection. It's on the assignment tab, and I've changed the assignment tab slightly. And the original assignment had you do a reflection based on the Agronoff 2006 article, which was that the article that you all commented on this past week on these 10 lessons. And I think that was a really interesting article, and my original intent was have you write on that, and I'm still leaving that option open, and if you want to write on that, please do. But I want you to have another option, and that is one of the readings for this week. That's the Thurmeyer and Wood 2002 article on the interlocal agreements and Wood study in the Kansas City area. I think that's also a really interesting article. And so either one of those is an option for you to write on for the reading reflection for this week. The next big thing that's coming up, it's week 9, which starts on July 10th, I believe. That's the Unit 4 area where we go into the 3 separate tracks. And if you read in the syllabus and read ahead, you know that the 3 tracks are emergency management, healthcare, and city to state and city to other government relationships. So what I want you to do, you can read all the material for all 3 tracks. That's fine with me. There's a lot of good articles in there, and they really specialize. But what I really want you to do is select one of the tracks and then stick with it, because I'm going to focus the discussions and the reading reflections accordingly, assuming that everybody sticks in just one track. So pick one and let me know which one you're picking. Actually, by email, that would be good, so I know how many people are in each track. Then what's going to happen is the reading reflection number 3, which will be due on July 16th, and number 4, due July 30th. Those 2 reflections, what I'm going to ask each student to do is to select a reading from their track literature and write on one of those selections. So those selections will be up to you, but it has to be one of the ones that I've included in each of the tracks. Okay, so the big thing then after that is the term project. Now, please make special note of this. This is also in the syllabus, and it's on the assignments tab. But the term project is due August 7th. That is the Sunday before the official end of the term. The official end of the term for summer is August 12th, which is a Friday. But I am making your term project due on August 7th, and here's why. What I want to spend that last week doing in class is this is our presentation time. So just as if we were in a live class, typically we would spend the last week or 2 in student presentations. This is no exception. I want everyone to post their presentation as a separate thread on the discussion board, and there are instructions. There will be instructions on that. And then I want you to comment on each other's presentations, just as you would in class. So that's what we'll be doing that last week. There's a couple other things, as you know from reading the syllabus, that are due with that, and I will remind you of this later. That is that for each presentation on the assignments tab, when you provide that to me, I'd like you to provide an abstract and a reference page written to APA style. So that's also part of the assignment grade. So the total 100-point assignment includes all those things. So that's the term project. More to follow on that. But what I would ask right now is if you think you're going to have technical issues with that, please let me know. What I'm asking for is a PowerPoint presentation with a voiceover. I will say that what I found is that if you save it as a video or you save it as a PDF, you actually use up a lot less space, and it's a lot easier to handle. But I think probably a lot of you know a heck of a lot more about presentations than I do, and so I'm really kind of looking forward to seeing some of the professional presentations. So let me just move on to what we're going to talk about for this week, for the rest of this lecture. Okay, this reading from Miller and Cox, which is in the text, in the Thurmaier and Meek text, I rely heavily on for this lecture, and I springboard off of that to discuss a couple of other things that I think are important to talk about when we're talking about cities and intergovernmental management within cities and between entities in a metropolitan area. So let's talk about some of these things that Miller and Cox emphasize. First of all, one of the things they emphasize is this tension on how we view cities. There are a lot of ways we can view cities, but the two of the ways they suggest is that there's a legal perspective that we have of cities, and that there's a political cultural perspective that we have of cities. The fourth point under legal perspectives, maybe I could have written first, and that is this idea that the Constitution is completely mute on the status of cities and towns. They are not mentioned at all in the Constitution. And we spent some time talking about what the Federalist Papers had to say about state to national government relationships, but there's nothing that is said about cities, which is curious when you think about it, as in some cases cities predate the states. But we're all familiar by now with this idea of Dillon's rule, which was proffered by this Judge Dillon in Iowa in 1868, when he said that cities are creatures of the state. They're mere tenants at will of their respective legislatures, and that a city could be eliminated at the stroke of a pen. And that's very true in most cases. Cities are, in fact, a legal entity subordinate to the state, and the state is sovereign. So this implies this top-down or adversarial democracy, and there is this adversarial relationship within the legal framework of state to city. So, for example, let's talk about revenue, and this is an area where the tension between cities and the state becomes evident typically. I'll use my home state of Nebraska, where I live now. I've lived in many other states, and this is not atypical. The state may have a sales tax, and it may be set at a particular percentage of retail sales, say 7%. But the state may also have a statute that allows cities, by vote of the electorate, for example, or even vote of the council, to add a 0.5%, a 0.25%, a 1%. And so what you'll see is that, yes, indeed, the state is allowing the city to set its own revenue structure in that case, but it's putting restrictions on it. It can only be a certain percentage point. Cities may end up trying to come up with other revenue sources. Many cities use things like restaurant taxes or occupation taxes to increase their revenue. And often these kinds of things create tension with the state legislature. So there is this adversarial relationship within the legal framework that prescribes how cities operate within the state. But then there's also this political cultural perspective, which is also very interesting in American history. So, there's this idea of a bottom-up or a unitary democracy, which is a Jeffersonian idea. And that's my third point there. In the idealized or almost mythological Jeffersonian democracy, Jefferson believed that democracy worked best when it was at the local level, at the small scale, and he talked a lot about yeoman farmers and small towns. And so there's this idea that we have that democracy works best at this local level. And then there's this other idea, which I'll get to in a minute. That's my first point there, which is cities really and towns are creatures of the citizens. So think of this as something like freedom of association, which we all ascribe to. So it's very common in some parts of the country, in most parts of the country, to realize that towns and cities in regions have been settled by people who are fairly homogeneous. So in the Midwest, the upper Midwest, for example, Minnesota, North Dakota, it's very common to find cities that were settled by people from Norway or people from Germany, for example. And at the time of their settlement, it would be very common to find that everyone in a town in North Dakota, for example, was Norwegian or German, and they all happened to be German Lutherans in their religion. So there's this idea that towns and cities are a cultural haven, if you will, for people of like mind. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not actually passing judgment on, but it's very common in our history. And the final point I'd make is that many cities in the United States, even major cities, predate the states of which they're subordinate. So think of New Orleans. Think of St. Louis, which were settlements of the French prior to the United States making the Louisiana Purchase. So it's really interesting that states actually have the legal sovereignty in the arrangement because, in fact, cities have a history that's connected but also somewhat separate from the states in which they reside. So there is this tension. And so then there's a second tension that Miller and Cox point out, and there's this tension is between what we consider the values of democracy as Americans and the structure of democracy as Americans. So what do I mean by that? The values of democracy, you're all PA students, you realize that some of the things we say we value are equality, equity, and public interest. And we know that the definitions of those things are sometimes hard to come up with, and people argue about, what does equality really mean? What does equity really mean? What is the public interest? But those are values that we have. But we also have a kind of a structural view of democracy, and that is that for a political entity, whether that's a city or a state or a country, to be a democracy, there has to be this formal structure. So we have to have a way of formally establishing rights. We have to have opportunity for participation. We have to have institutions that protect these things. So a very mechanical example is if you go to your city or town, if you go to the city council meeting that may be once a month or more often, you'll notice typically they'll use Robert's Rules of Orders, and it's almost very mechanical, but the purpose of those kinds of structures are actually to afford people the opportunity to participate and afford citizens the opportunity to be heard. So there's this structure of democracy, but these things are sometimes there's a tension between them as well, right? So what is the best kind of democracy? Is it a direct democracy? For example, the classical Athenian city-state or the New England town meeting? Is it representative democracy, where we elect councilors at the city level, or we elect state senators or representatives, or we elect members of Congress or senators to represent us? And then there's even tension within that idea, as we know. So do we consider representatives to be our delegates who, speak as authorized by us, or do we elect people because we share values with them or we share opinions with them, and then we trust them to vote in a way that broadly represents us? So do we think that smallness is necessary for a democracy to take place, or is there more democracy or less democracy in a small town or a large city? And Miller and Cox say this. They say this idyllic view of the small town dominates the American vision of proper government. So there is this cultural idea in the United States that, small town may be more democratic than big city. But the fact of the matter is, most of us live in big cities or in metropolitan areas. Far more of us live in metropolitan areas than in small towns in the United States, even though there may be this view that small towns are more democratic. So what's the problem with this? Well, the problem with this, as I'm going to get to in a second, is then how do we govern in the metropolitan area? And so Miller and Cox move on to this idea of metropolitan government. And they say that there's two ways, again, we can consider what metropolitan government should look like. There's the organic metropolis or the economic metropolis. So when they talk about the organic metropolis, they're talking very much, again, about the legal structure. So in the early 1900s, there was a move on the part of many to say that cities really, metropolitan cities, should annex and gobble up as much of the surrounding cities as they can, because that just is simply more efficient for governance. At the same time, there was disagreement on that. So if you go to Minneapolis, for example, you'll see there's hundreds of cities, hundreds of incorporated cities in the Minneapolis and St. Paul area. And this is because there's a Minnesota law passed around 1900 that says that for one city to annex another, both cities have to be in agreement. So both cities would have to vote on that and say, yes, we're going to merge. Well, that rarely would happen. So the result is there are hundreds of cities in this about 8 or 9 county area in the Minneapolis metropolitan area, but they're not legally connected in a lot of ways. They go on to talk about this 1960s and 1970s, where we see the city as a provider of social welfare. So again, in kind of the cooperative federalism mode, cities in the 60s and 70s very much saw themselves an agent of federal social programs. But at the same time, the 60s and 70s saw the core cities falling apart. So this was the era of so-called white flight, when white people would move to the suburbs so that they could send their children to separate school districts, for example. By the 90s, we're seeing that that arrangement really was a little bit bankrupt. And so we see the move back to cities. But we also see this idea that cities, metropolitan areas, are clusters where things can happen. Not only settlement of people in neighborhoods, but also businesses may choose to locate in cities. So, for example, the idea of this theory is that a company won't choose to locate in a city where they can't take advantage of things like an educated workforce, where they can't take advantage of things like laws that would allow a diverse workforce in their company. And so what Miller and Cox say, the basis of this theory is that the stronger the economic growth of the center city, the stronger the economic growth of the suburbs, even if legally there are still many cities. But then there's this idea of the economic metropolis. And if you've never read what Thibault wrote, and that's how you pronounce his name, he wrote this article way back in 1956, so actually 60 years ago. This journal article called A Pure Theory of Local Expenditures. And so what Thibault said was that people exercise public choice. They have preferences for public goods. So public goods can be things like parks, schools, roads, sewer systems. And so, in a sense, people choose to live in cities much like they choose to buy things in different stores in a shopping mall. And this implies that local governments are in competition with each other for citizens. So think of a metropolitan area that you may live in. People may choose to live in suburbs, and they may say the reason I choose to live there is because the tax base is constructed mostly on a lower property tax, or I choose to live in this city because in fact it's mostly senior citizens and I'm a senior citizen. I don't want my taxes going for schools. And so this was what Thibault was actually talking about. And so really it's seeing cities as competing businesses within the same business environment, if you will. But that, when we get to the provision of services like fire protection, police protection, in fact, we can separate those things out. We could actually buy production of services from other cities. If we don't want to pay for a fire department, then we may buy fire protection from another city close by. So it's very much the idea that cities compete just in a sort of a metropolitan marketplace. And so how do we bridge those two theories? Well, what Miller and Cox suggest is that the best way to do that is regional institutions. So we're going to talk for the rest of this lecture about regional institutions, and they say some interesting things, at least one of which I find a little bit ironic and I'm going to take issue with. But think of regional institutions in your area, and I'm going to mention some in a minute here, but you could think of these organizations as confederations of individual cities, but in that case they're sort of like the Articles of Confederation, and that is where each entity, each city, has its own self-interest, and they're not really motivated to act beyond their self-interest. Or you could have a regional institution that's sort of divorced from local governments, but in that case they lack credibility with their own voters. So what they suggest is, should we consider regional institutions instead as networks? And typically in a network you may find the existence of interlocal agreements, which is a device that is used to provide services to each other on a reciprocal basis or on a paid basis. And they're typically negotiated by professional communities. So here we're getting more into this idea that there are many networks within metropolitan governance. And let's talk about that just for a second. So actually, before I do, here's the part that I found a little bit ironic. In the article, when you read it, you may get the same impression I did, and that is that Miller and Cox are very excited about the European Union, and see this as a way to promote regional democracy. It's interesting, the very day, today is Thursday, that I'm recording this lecture, is the day that in the UK there was a vote on what's called Brexit, or the exit of Britain from the European Union. And we could think of what's been happening in Greece for the last several years. And so you would get the impression that maybe not all is well in the European Union. But the example that they use for governance is still, it's still apt. And that is that the European Parliament is composed of representatives based on population, and that for the European Parliament to actually do anything that affects member states, they have to have a supermajority. And so they have this quote, reinforced by supermajority voting and other protections for national interests, the members of the EU Parliament and its administrative agencies have the opportunity to function based on the Burkean model, that's Edmund Burke, model of representation, and that there is an identifiable European interest manifest in its decisions. So they're just using the EU as an example simply to say that in the metropolitan areas, there are interests of the separate cities, of the separate incorporated towns and cities, but there is also a metropolitan interest. And so from that he goes on and they talk about this Southwestern Pennsylvania Commission, which is, in fact, a regional governance board. It's composed of commissioners. That's why it's called a commission. And these commissioners, though, are also commissioners in the counties around the Pittsburgh area, and they're also members of the Pittsburgh Council and the Pittsburgh Mayor. And so there's commissions in the counties and towns and councils, and then there are commissioners at the regional level. And you can read that article, and what they're very excited about is the fact that regionally this has been very successful and is growing in importance. But, there are other examples of regional governments, and I think some of you have mentioned these. There's a Greater Portland Council of Governments. There's a Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. And we talked about this. One student talked about the current issues going on with the metro in Washington, D.C. And, this is a huge issue for the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. How do they decide, what rail lines to close when on the metro to repair them? There's this Metropolitan Council in about the 8-county Minneapolis region, in south central, southeast Minnesota. There's the Maricopa Association of Governments. There are many, many other associations of governments that either have, either a weak or a stronger regional presence. And so Miller and Cox are pointing, hopefully, I think, optimistically towards this era of new cooperation. They say a new era of cooperation. And so I do not question what they're saying, though I think there's room to say maybe we're not that cooperative. In my home state, and this is very common in many states across the United States, we continue to have an argument over school funding, and that would be state versus local. The typical local school system is based on property tax, which is levied locally. States, in order to fund K-12 education, would have to restructure their tax base. They could go to property tax at the state level. Many states have chosen not to do that now. They could change to a different kind of income tax or sales tax. The point is, to gain more state support for K-12 education, the tax structure would have to be revamped a little bit. It might or might not cost people more in taxes, but it would have to be revamped. And I think we can still see that cities continue to compete in this manner that Thibault talked about. They compete with each other economically for businesses to come to their neighborhood, if you will. And even within the same metropolitan area, cities compete with each other. In my own city of Omaha, Omaha has a restaurant tax, which was passed about 4 or 5 years ago. 2.5%. So every $1 you spend in a restaurant, you're going to pay an additional 2.5 cents in addition to the state sales tax and the local sales tax. And that was a really big and controversial deal. And cities in the metro area said, hey, come and eat in other cities. We don't have a restaurant tax in our city, which is right next to Omaha. it didn't really pan out to be such a bad thing, and in fact, restaurants really didn't lose business over it. But it's just an example of how cities compete in this TiVo manner. So this week I've assigned those readings, and so this was just sort of an overview of what's in them. Again, you have the reading reflection assignments for this week. I'm looking forward to reading those. I'm giving you a break from discussing this week, and we'll be back at it after the 4th of July. So everybody have a nice 4th of July. I'm looking forward to reading your reading reflection papers. Thanks very much.